Art in France in the 19th century is often defined in terms of developments in painting. And in fact, it is true that painting is in the forefront. The developments that literally lead to our naming a movement typically are events early on in painting. Sculpture is generally discussed in passing insofar as it relates to painting, so that we use some of the same terms, Romanticism, Classicism, to refer to sculpture. But stylistic advances in sculpture really lagged behind painting. It is not until the end of the 19th century that a sculptor would redefine the traditional solid, void, mass, space, open, closed, balanced, idealized approach to representation of composition. And that sculptor is Auguste Rodin, R-O-D-I-N. But before we consider Rodin, we need to look at just a very brief overview of what's going on in the 19th century. Again, we have been concentrating on painting, but the program of instruction in sculpture at the École des Beaux-Arts was equivalent to that for painters. Students were admitted to the school who had had previous training, especially in drawing. Yes, even though you were going to be a sculptor, you couldn't be an artist if you didn't know how to draw. Progress was measured by a series of competitions, with the ultimate competition being, like painting, the Prix de Rome, but in sculpture, the Rome Prize. Sculpture students were required to complete a sketch of an assigned subject from history, and then to create the final work in relief sculpture. The finished relief had to be an almost exact replica of the sketch. You're not going to start interpreting when you're carving. You have to show your finesse at working with the material. A student was not expected then to be inventive in any of this work. And again, that sounds rather like painting. This is the relief that won the Prix de Rome in 1811. The Death of Epaminondas by David d'Angers. A scene from Greek history showing the dying heroine, a 4th century Theban warrior. Winning the Prix de Rome, of course, again, as with painters, was the highest honor and considered to be the thing that every potentially great sculptor wanted to win. And winning it, David d'Angers has demonstrated that he has created the best solution to an assignment because, of course, as with the Prix de Rome in painting, they were assigned a certain subject. In France in the 19th century, more sculpture was produced than had been produced at any other time in any century. This is particularly due to technological innovations that were facilitating the production of multiples in the 19th century, and a new attitude toward reproduction and multiples. And the reason that multiples ultimately came about is because there was a market for them. You get an increasingly fluid middle class who have the money to spend, and they want to buy sculpture. What they don't want, of course, is some gigantic, huge work, but smaller pieces. And so again, we begin to see the industrialization and importance of being able to create many works on a kind of line based on casting, for instance. And I'm going to talk about that in a moment. Among the most famous examples of sculpture of the 19th century are the sculptures that are on the Arc de Triomphe, which we've all seen or heard of. The Great Triumphal Arch at the center of Paris. They're the work of François Rude, R-U-D-E, Rude, François Rude, who attended the École des Beaux-Arts and won the Prix de Rome in sculpture in the early 19th century. He was trained in the conservative classical tradition, but his work evolved over a period of time, as was true of any young artist in the 19th century who became aware of the historical context. He was a Republican, and then he switched and he became a Bonapartist. And then when a monarchy came back into power, he had to leave. He was exiled to Belgium. He returned to Paris, however, in 1826, and he developed a successful career, receiving major commissions in 1831 and then in 1833. The commissions were to create 2 of 4 reliefs for the upright piers of the Arc de Triomphe. The Arc de Triomphe, by the way, was built by Napoleon, whose entire empire was meant to be an emulation of the Roman Empire, and a triumphal arch is a traditional Roman-style monument. The reliefs which Rude designed and carved comprised a series of historical but allegorical works, summarizing the different phases of the Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. So they had a strong historical context. The first commission was the return of the army from Egypt. The second commission, which he completed, is considered to be his masterpiece, The Departure of the Volunteers in 1792, carved by Rude in 1833. It is more familiarly known as La Marseillaise, which is the French national anthem. I'm showing it to you from one point of view here, and then I have a frontal view of it. It's a rather interesting work, and is somewhat reminiscent of Delacroix's figure of France at the barricades, if you remember, because you have this figure who is an allegorical female representation of the Republic, who is dressed like a soldier in the upper torso, but then has some drapery that basically flies through her legs as she leads the troops forward, as she encourages the revolutionary army, who are represented by a panoply of about 6 soldiers from old to young, who in essence represent the belief in the revolution. It is a work that clearly is based upon many of the traditions of classical academic sculpture, very naturalistic and competent representation of the figures and all of the historical details. But there's also a kind of romantic emotionalism to it, which is an aspect, certainly, of the early 19th century. But it's one of the great works of Rude that was very well received. Another important sculptor of the 19th century is Antoine-Louis Barye. Barye studied painting and sculpture at the École des Beaux-Arts in the early 19th century. And early in his career, he became absolutely fascinated with the potential of representing animals in sculpture. He worked at the zoo in Paris. He made drawings from animal dissections. His concentration on animals as subject of sculpture challenged the traditional hierarchy in terms of subject matter for the finest sculpture, because as with painting, the primary subject matter should have been the human body and the idealized human body. But for Barye, if humans were represented, it was almost as if they are ancillary to the representation of animals. Animal painting, by the way, ranked very low, as you might imagine, would animal sculpture. Barye was among those who began to experiment with creating multiples in order to sell many examples of the same work that he had designed. And he marketed them for the homes of middle-class Parisians as tabletop decorations. They were very popular, despite the fact that there was a continuing sort of prejudice against small-scale sculpture, which was considered to be completely inferior and impossible in terms of challenging large-scale public sculpture. In the Salon of 1850, Barre showed a pair of works, one that might be considered to some extent based upon classical tradition, and that is Theseus combating the centaur, which you see represented on the left, and the other one a purely sort of romantic work in which a jaguar has captured a rabbit, a hare, and is literally eating it in front of our eyes. These are relatively small works. The one on the left is about 18 to 20 inches in height. So again, these were meant to be purchased by the middle class, and they would then have them in their homes. It was actually in Barre's workshop that the modern phenomenon of serial production of an artist's design was instituted. At the Universal Exposition of 1855, Barre exhibited in the fine arts section and in the industrial bronze section. So he was literally showing his work in two very different venues, in two very different places in terms of the respect that one might get from those in power. Another important artist of the 19th century in relation to sculpture is Jean-Baptiste Carpeaux. That's spelled capital C-A-R-P-E-A-U-X, Carpeaux, C-A-R-P-E-A-U-X. Although born in the 19th century, living in fact until 1875, Carpeau's work is sometimes seeming more close to Rococo and Baroque types because of the sensuousness and the gracefulness of his figures. He studied with Rude, R-U-D-E, the sculptor whom we talked about at the beginning, and he did win the Prix de Rome in 1854. So this was a very talented sculptor. In 1863, the architect of the new Paris Opera House, Charles Garnier, offered Carpeaux a chance to sculpt one of the monumental sculpture groups that was to be placed down below on the pier elements. Here, I think you can see that there are sculptural elements here. And so Garnier commissioned Carpeaux to sculpt one of the monumental groups for the facade of the new opera house, which he had in fact designed. By the way, the opera house in Paris is extraordinary. When you go to Paris, you need to just walk inside. There are days it's opened where you can just go on a little tour. And you have never seen as glorious paintings in the dome of any building until you see the Marc Chagall's in the Opera House. Now, Chagall is 20th century. I'm just telling you, they are remarkable. But now we're talking about the 18th century, and one of the remarks I want to make about a building that was constructed in the second half of the 19th century, did I just say 18th century? In the second half of the 19th century is, that looks awfully Baroque to me. B-A-R-O-Q-U-E, Baroque. Yes? It doesn't look classical. It's not a kind of stripped-down classicism. And it looks almost Rococo in the amount of decoration. And that's because architects in France were trained in what was called historicism. You were trained in certain specific historical periods. But of course, that kind of left out the modern period and invention, right? Because if you have to design your buildings based on either classical, Gothic, Rococo, or Baroque, because that's what you had been trained in, it would be very hard to break away and design a new kind of building. So, modern architecture is going to take even longer than sculpture to make a breakthrough. The work that Carpeaux created is called The Dance. Today there's a copy of this work on the facade of the Opéra. It's entirely too valuable and fragile to still be on the building itself. It stands over 15 feet tall. And after the work was erected on the Opera House, it was vandalized and threatened with removal because people thought it was so disgusting. So what's wrong with it? I mean, is this not fully in the tradition of French academic painting, where you have some nude, some figures partially clothed? They are dancing around. What's wrong with it? Even the male genitals are covered. I mean, what's wrong with it? Look at the two women, left and right front. What can you tell me about them? What can you tell me about them? Don't know. Again, that's 2012 eyes. I'm trying to train your eyes. It's 1867. I'm sorry?
The S curve?
No, it's not so much the composition of the S-shaped curve. I'm going to wait until you tell me. It's 1867. So what about the expressions? They have their teeth showing, actually. They're joyous. They're dancing. See, it's really hard because you're going, I don't see anything wrong with them. I mean, they're perfectly fine. Yes?
It's not conservative.
What do you mean by that? I have someone else behind you, Christian. What were you going to say?
They're lesbian?
Oh, interesting. Why do you say that? How do you know? How can you physically look at someone and say they're lesbian?
Well, it's their own hand.
Sorry?
Their own hand.
Oh, they're holding hands. Oh, no, they're dancing. Dancing around the maypole. Yeah. So interesting. I'm not sure you can tell, if someone's a lesbian by looking at them with no clothes on. But yes. What? No, you're just kind of...
Because they're dancing naked.
Because they're dancing naked? What is academic classicism all about? But naked models, right? It's 1867, people. Yes.
They're not idealized.
They're not idealized. I mean, they're kind of plain and frumpy looking. I mean, look at her. Is this a classical model? Look at this. No, they're not idealized. They're too real. So that's another case of you have to put yourself back into the time period. They were considered ugly. Dancing around a nude male. There was a little bit of the immorality of it, but only because they weren't called Venus or, Aphrodite and Artemis dancing around, It's because, who the hell are they? This gets back to Manet. Who is this woman reclining on this couch? We know who she is. So in that way, we're reading it as if it's insulting and disgusting and indecent. They are too real. It was called the most impure work by which modern sculpture has been desecrated. In 1866, Carpeaux established an atelier to reproduce his works for sale. In the early 1870s, he developed, along with a technician, a technique for casting terracotta that allowed for, again, multiples and cheaper material as well, for even for large-scale groups. The place of sculpture into the 19th century continued to be one of monumental public art, which was supposed to be more conservative, obviously, than what we're seeing here with our artist. And that is something that is going to be a real problem in terms of public art in general, because it's pretty much into an impossible situation that we get the beginning of the career of Auguste Rodin. Considered the most revolutionary sculptor of the 19th century, never accepted as a student at the École des Beaux-Arts. In fact, he had to leave France in order to be trained in Brussels. He did, however, study with Barre for a short period of time. See, they all knew each other. Félix Nadar, he was the man who gave his old photo studio over to the Impressionists for their first exhibition. This is The Man with the Broken Nose, an early salon try by Rodin, which was rejected because it was offensively realistic. 1864. To make a living in his early years, Rodin made decorative groups and sort of generic portrait busts, which could be duplicated and sold to a mass market. So, in other words, this is a man who knew what he wanted to do with his art, but knew how he had to kowtow, in essence, to the public who only wanted certain things. So he sold to a mass market works such as this one, a young girl with roses in her hat, because it was very non-threatening, it was very charming, it was the kind of work that could be made in multiples and sold in order to for him to make a living. But his own evolution was toward greater and greater abstraction and subjective approach to sculpture. So I do want you to see this. This is a man, it's sort of like I have to defend Picasso when we look at Picasso. I have to show you what Picasso was doing when he was 13 for you then to accept that you don't think he could paint. It's because it simply has become irrelevant. I mean, it's uninspiring. It is, I mean, it's charming, it's realistic, it's naturalistic, it's pretty, but it's not moving us anywhere. The Age of Bronze was Rodin's first major signed work. It's life-size. It's over 6 feet tall. It was shown at the Salon of 1877, and it was successful, but it was very controversial. And why was it controversial? Again, it goes back to that interpretation of a work as being too realistic. In fact, it looked so realistic that some critics accused Rodin of having worked from live casts, plaster casts. How does that work? George Siegel made a whole career out of that, the modern sculptor, where he took plaster casts from parts of people's bodies and put them back together again. They were basically accusing him of working from casts instead of actually working on the model himself in clay or in wax. And he always denied the accusations of using life casts. Rodin's works are said to have been inspired by his early admiration for Michelangelo. I show you, for instance, Michelangelo's Dying Slave from 1513. This work by Michelangelo was in the Louvre at this time. It is still in the Louvre today. You can see it. And it's also always been pointed out that it may have been the direct source of inspiration for the so-called Age of Bronze. That title, the Age of Bronze, was not the title given by Rodin when he first sought to show the work, but in fact it was given a variety of titles including some that hopefully would give it more context or make you think about it more seriously. Man awakening to nature, the wounded soldier, the awakening of humanity, and then finally, the age of bronze. Unlike traditional classical-based works representing an allegorical figure, it probably was never intended to represent a specific subject for Rodin, nor did he ever feel that he had to justify any of his pieces with a title that would help you then understand it through metaphor or allegory or mythology. His attitude towards subject matter reflects the approach of the Impressionists. Subject matter isn't always as important as the search to represent some aspects of the human form in terms of light, for instance. This work, the St. John the Baptist preaching, was shown at the Salon of 1880. It was shown actually in a plaster original, which the state purchased. It brings us to the fact that you may have traveled a bit, and you may have said to yourself, didn't I see that Rodin in Philadelphia? Didn't I see that Rodin in Pasadena? Didn't I see that Rodin in Boston? Didn't I see that in Paris or in London? And that's because there are multiples of his work. Remember, we talked about that as an important aspect of sculpture in the 19th century. Today, there are 14 full-size bronze casts of St. John the Baptist. 5 of them are in the United States. Cast number 7 is in the Norton Simon in Pasadena. The number of works, there are in fact 50 total of St. John the Baptist, but they're in 3 different sizes. They're 14 full-size or life-size. Was possible because Rodin approved the reproduction of the works at a bronze casting foundry at the end of the 19th century. So again, he's approving the work. The works are numbered, rather like prints are numbered, and that they are considered legitimate works by the artist. The St. John moves beyond the Age of Bronze. The Age of Bronze is looking fairly conservative to us now. This is squarer, more angular, more strange in the way that it's somewhat inorganic, as though he's inventing or reinventing the body. The fact that the work had no symbolic attribute removed it from full appropriateness. I mean, you could give it the title St. John the Baptist Preaching, but you really couldn't tell. That could have been a title just given to it for the critics to not to criticize it as being meaningless. There was even some suggestion to Rodin that he put a cross in the hand of the figure so that it be very closely allied and understood as a religious figure. But he didn't see it as a religious figure. Particularly, he saw it as a study of movement. Rodin studied his models in constant motion, in changing positions and attitudes, and he did it himself. He would not only turn his model, he would turn the clay or the form that he was working on, constantly attempting to capture the transitory moment in time, which is a very different idea of sculpture, which tends to try to catch the classic moment in time and sort of freeze it. He wasn't interested in freezing that classic posture, which, by the way, continued to be used for models, for drawings at the École des Beaux-Arts and in the studios of artists who were teaching the younger generation. He wanted to show changing positions and attitudes and gestures, all of it within one figure, as if it was an illusion of life, as if the statue were living and could move right in front of us. And that interest in movement eventually becomes a surface that doesn't seem to quite reflect the muscles and the ligaments and all of the elements that we can see through the skin, because he's showing you more than you would see at one time. Does that make sense in terms of what you're even looking at now? The lack of a smoother, more definitive, particularly torso in the St. John provoked a lot of criticism. One critic stating, quote, "Monsieur Rodin shows us in his St. John that vice has its manner of expression and ugliness its degrees. It would be difficult to find anything more repulsive than this statue." I mean, again, this same critic must have been the one who talked about Manet. But there were mixed reviews, and it was one of his early successes. He received a commission for a set of bronze doors for the Museum of Decorative Arts in August of 1880. He chose Dante's Inferno for the theme of the doors. He wanted to create a pair of doors for the Museum of Decorative Arts that would be comparable in its passion and power to medieval church entrances, particularly Romanesque and Gothic church entrances that, of course, were typically covered with sculptures that told of the narratives of the Bible. He would produce what's known as the Gates of Hell, which were left unfinished after his death in 1917 and were not even cast in bronze in their finished, or rather unfinished state until the 1920s. So he actually never completely finished the Gates of Hell. I remind you that Dante and the Divine Comedy was subject matter that appealed greatly to the romantic sensibility in the first half of the 19th century, and it is equally appealing to Rodin, because he is an artist who is strongly interested in what we call expressionism, a very subjective approach to representation. He likes to distort for the sake of the message. He literally dilutes the surface of the doors by creating imagery that is partial, that is broken, that catches light and dark and is totally manipulated by the forms themselves, and that capture movement. Again, that idea that it's constantly moving, that it's alive. We see from this work that Rodin, in terms of sculptural technique, was a modeler as opposed to a carver. And there's a big difference. Someone who models is building. Someone who carves is tearing down. All right? And you need to have skills, certainly, in both of those arenas to be a great sculptor. But he was a modeler. He preferred the additive technique. Some of the individual figures designed for the Gates of Hell are famous as independent works. For instance, in the lintel, the crossbeam at the top of the door, in a position which in a medieval church doorway would have been the position of a Christ enthroned. All right, you with me? Christ would have been there. He put what is known as the thinker. The original size of the thinker was only 28 inches. Again, it was to be part of some extraordinary imagery that he designed for the Gates of Hell. It's one of his best-known works. The figure was designed to be placed in the middle of the doors as a focal point at the top. We were going to look at it no matter what because it stuck out from the rest of the figures. And it's possible that he intended it to represent Dante, whose Gates of Hell, of course, reflect on the Inferno, which was the source of inspiration for the doors. It shows a magnificent, muscled, seated male figure, again with that kind of pulsating surface or skin that seems to be reflecting, again, constant movement of the muscles, of the internal aspects, and of the light across his back and his chest and his arms. The work was inspired by Rodin's knowledge and continuing admiration for Michelangelo. In this case, very possibly a knowledge of Jeremiah, one of the great prophets from the Sistine Chapel ceiling. But it is also very reminiscent of another work by Michelangelo from the tomb of Lorenzo de' Medici in Florence, a 16th century work. And if you look at it, you know, if an artist visually gets that image on the left by Michelangelo into his head and knows that he's going to work with it at some point, you can see it as a kind of translation. But from a very controlled, classic kind of composition for the Michelangelo to an exceedingly expressionistic and moody composition in the Rodin. The thinker, as far as Rodin was concerned, was the artist as well, pondering his life, pondering his work, pondering immortality through his work. A cast of it was placed on his grave when he died in 1917. It's a work that reflects very strongly on at least two currents in the 19th century that shows us this is a convoluted, difficult period to begin to try to analyze according to very distinct movements. It's very much a romantic work, and it's very much a realistic work. Okay,